So thank you guys for joining us. This is our third Developing Infrastructure Group meeting for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows. And today we are talking about the policy planning and engineering behind transportation accessibility for systematically transportation disadvantaged communities, as well as the impacts of the access to transportation on public health, the economy, the environment, quality of life, etc. Our panelists today bring expertise in multimodal transportation and from multiple different perspectives from the public and private sectors, think tanks, advocacy, in both national and international contexts. So today we're going to be hearing from Carol Tyson, Stanford Turner, and Chris Pangilinan. Carol Tyson works in coalition with disability and civil rights partners, as well as industry stakeholders, and focuses on transportation equity, healthcare, supports and services needed to remain in communities, education, and civil rights. Carol has served on advisory committees and advocates for safe and equitable access to transportation, on-demand services, public rights-of-way, rail, and air travel. Prior to their disability advocacy, Carol served as a researcher in the labor movement in both US and Australia. Stanford Turner is joining us from Singapore, and I believe is still there, yeah. And coordinates global work on public transport, including bus electrification, informal transit, and bus rapid transit. Before he was at ITDP, Stan worked for the World Bank's Infrastructure Office in Southeast Asia, and before that for the Eno Center for Transportation and the Pew MacArthur Results First Initiative. Chris Pangilinan is joining us, and he works to help public transportation agencies and riders harness Uber's technology platform to make transit more convenient and easier for all users. His work also includes improving accessibility for people with disabilities to the Uber platform and services. And prior to joining Uber, Chris has held a variety of roles in advocacy, local transit authorities in the public sector, and at the US Department of Transportation. So we have lots of expertise joining us today, and I'm actually going to turn it over to the panelists now to sort of further introduce themselves, maybe give their title and the organization they are with, and then tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are professionally and one of the projects that you're working on or that your organization is working on related to the topic of access to transportation that you're particularly excited about right now. And I'm going to turn it over to Carol to get us started.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Carol. What am I supposed to say? I work for the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, which is, you can shorten it to DREDF. The rest of my colleagues are based in California. I'm in DC. DREDF is a legal and policy center that's been around since the 70s. And as a part of that job, I serve on a coalition called the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, which is a coalition of about 100 disability-related advocacy organizations that work on federal policy. We have task forces, and I'm a co-chair of the Transportation Task Force. How I got to where I am is always, I'm never quite sure. but if I try to figure that out, I started in the labor movement. As was mentioned, I worked on Justice for Janitors campaigns and all sorts of other campaigns for about 10 years. And that's where I got a lot of training. I did strategic research and policy. While I was doing that, I was hit by a bus. Here in DC, and became a part of the disability community. After some years living with a disability, I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand it more, and so I went back to school while I was working. Got a disability studies degree. Eventually, I switched and joined. Got an internship with the Disability Rights Organization, and then my first paid job was with the United Spinal Association. They have a long history of transportation advocacy. So I really fell into this work, and I was given the project of working to increase the numbers of accessible taxis in DC the same year that Uber and Lyft came to town. So that's the introduction. Current project is something that DREDF we're working on with colleagues, definitely not leading, but supporting and exciting to be a part of with the Equity Caucus, is removing enforcement from transportation safety programs and getting the federal government to think about that, looking at NHTSA's safety programs and the funds that are used to fund police enforcement and traffic stops. 33 to 50% of police use of force incidents involve a person with a disability. So there's a hearing tomorrow in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on this topic. So I'm really excited that it's getting attention. That's it.
Great, thank you very much. And I think with that transition, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, whose company landed in DC just as Carol was working on accessibility and ride hail. Chris, go for it.
Great, thank you, Alice. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Pangilinan. I lead public policy for public transportation and accessibility at Uber. I've been here for 2 years, and I've been working in the public transportation and accessibility space for a while now. How I got here is I actually started my career in transit in DC at the FTA as an intern, worked in Chicago and San Francisco and New York at the transit agencies in those cities, and dipped a little bit of my toe into the nonprofit advocacy world, working at Transit Center, where I really started to pick up my work in accessibility advocacy there. It's still ongoing in the world of New York City subway accessibility. If you've ever been to New York, you know that it is not necessarily the most accessible city in the world, and the subway is a good representation of that, where only 25% of all subway stations are accessible, and a number of them are out of service every day. So that really got me involved in accessibility. And I guess you can't tell me sitting here. The reason why I'm interested in that is I normally use a wheelchair to get around. So that is why personally it affects me in getting around New York City or other places where they're not as accessible. And so while in my work at a transit center and other places, I started actually looking at work in the area of mobility on demand, and actually worked with Carol on this topic as well, of how we can see how mobility on demand and transit can work together in ways that would benefit public transportation, but also still remain accessible to everyone, including people with disabilities. And that work continues now while I'm at Uber, in melding my work in public transportation and accessibility with this on-demand ride-hailing company to see how we can make the best use of public on-demand systems with public transportation to improve the systems for everybody today. So yeah, that is me. Oh, and a current project I'm working on. I'm working on right now a project to develop public policies and other mechanisms to get more on-demand wheelchair accessible vehicles on the Uber platform, with my goal of having a much broader rollout of on-demand vehicles on Uber's platform in the United States, Canada, and beyond. And so very exciting. I'm hoping that this will be a successful project in which we can see those results in a couple of years.
Great, thank you, Chris. All right, I'm trying to figure out how Zoom works. I think I can now put you guys in the spotlight when you're talking. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stan.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, all. My name is Stan Turner, or Stan Turner, as Alice has used, and I'm the transit manager for the research and impact team, global research and impact team for the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. As the bio that you read earlier, I coordinate the work around bus electrification, informal transportation, and bus rapid transit. To answer the kind of question of my path to this particular job, it's actually quite circuitous, and much like Carol, I think you kind of just fall into transportation or transit. And I guess I'll start. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. I went to school at Michigan State studying criminal justice, hoping to be a lawyer. I realized about halfway in this was not going to be the thing for me, so I ended up getting a dual degree in Latin American Caribbean Studies. And then, of course, I graduated in 2008, and that was essentially the recession. And I got an internship with an election administration group doing election reform. And then that turned into a job working on fiscal policy and econometrics with Pew MacArthur Results First initiative. During that time, though, I think it was around 2010, 2011, 2012, I actually, growing up in DC, I'd always used the bike getting around, and I was really impressed by how the city was making large investments in bike lanes and bringing in bike share and just the dedication that the city seemed to kind of be making towards cyclists, and was fascinated by how something like that could take place, especially in the hometown, kind of seeing it in real time. So I decided to go back to school. I went back to school to study urban planning, and got interested in the transportation sector as a whole there. And that was kind of my pathway to Eno, which, kind of aligned with my policy experience as well as transportation. I led their digital cities initiative for a year, and then I was fortunate enough to get married, and my wife ended up getting a position based in Singapore. And so I ended up making the leap of faith to move with her, on job and career unbeknown, and ended up finding a work opportunity with the World Bank's Infrastructure, Public-Private Partnerships and Guarantees Group in Southeast Asia. And that work largely led to my being in this position now with ITDP, which is similarly kind of focused on sustainable transport within lower income and middle income countries. I guess I'll cheat and say one of the projects that I'm working on is around bus electrification right now and developing a state of knowledge, which looks at policies, planning, maintenance and operation, and the implementation and deployment of battery electric buses. But I would also like to plug ITDP's work on Pedestrians First, which is an online resource and database that assesses walkability in cities, specifically around caregivers and families. It uses open data, and it helps kind of identify healthcare and job services for families specifically that I think is really intuitive and super easy to use, and something where I think the organization as a whole is very proud of. So with that, I will transition it back to Alice.
Awesome. And anybody who's ever talked to me about transportation knows that pedestrian infrastructure and planning is near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad you pointed that project out, Stan. We're actually going to start with two buzzwords that have been going around the transportation industry in the last, 3 to 5 years. One of those is innovation, and one of them is equity. So I was wondering if all of you can kind of give your opinions and your professional expertise around how the term innovation and how innovations in the field of transportation and technology can help advance our goals towards equity and equitable access to transportation and access to mobility options. Sort of how are we using innovation to advance equity now? How are we not using innovation to advance equity in ways that maybe we could be? And also in what ways is innovation maybe a direct barrier to reaching some of those equity goals that we need to be aware of moving forward to make sure that we counter and don't run into that problem? And I'll start this time. Let's just go back around and start back with Carol.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Usually on the inside, if it's not showing on my face, when I hear the word innovation, I am groaning or my eyes are rolling or I'm sighing deeply. Just because in my time doing this work, whenever there's some new innovative transportation service, it's usually not accessible, at least at the start. And so it is an afterthought, accessibility. And I'm thinking about like sort of the basic traditional sense of accessibility for people with disabilities, for people with physical disabilities, sensory, intellectual developmental disabled folks who are autistic, like all of those things. Usually anything that's innovative is not thinking about any of that. And we have to, like, once you are an advocate for accessible transportation, you feel like you're having the same conversation over and over and over again with each different mode. Like you can have the same one. It feels like a very basic job. So that's how I feel about innovation. And it's sad because like innovation should be like full of potential and should be like what we could all imagine that would work for absolutely everybody. And that I think is really the goal, is to try to get folks in the industry and transportation to realize that's where we can start. We don't have to like try to figure it out for people who are non-disabled first, then work on it for people with disabilities, but do the reverse, and that's going to have the biggest impact. And I think in relation to equity, as I said, they're usually not accessible, but they're oftentimes also not thinking as much about making sure the service is provided to people who are unbanked or don't have a smartphone, or may live in places where broadband access is spotty. So all of the equity considerations that have been brought up for years now, and that I worked on with Chris, who led a team. So yeah, that's my answer.
Great. I feel the same way. I feel like every time you hear people talking about new innovations, and then kind of afterwards, oh yeah, and then we'll figure out later how to make it accessible, or how to make this transferable in rural areas, or all sorts of you make it work in one very specific case study and then expand out. Whereas maybe if we sort of started from a bottom-up universal design perspective, there would be more equity from the outset, and we wouldn't have to be fighting the fights moving forward as much. I'll turn it over to Chris to see what your perspectives on this are, and maybe Carol, you might want to chime back in at the end. I'm particularly interested in our thoughts on automated vehicles and fleet electrification. So something to think about when we come back around. And Stan and Chris, if you have perspectives on that, go ahead and throw it in.
Sure, thanks, Alice. Yeah, Carol is absolutely right. It is the same conversations a lot of times. I think you can even go back even further, like obviously before ADA, which is so recent in human history here. But if you look at like New York City subway, or the subways in general, those were built in the 1800s, early 1900s, with no thought to anybody that couldn't use stairs, right, at all. And we're still paying that price today, and even in Boston, New York, Toronto, older cities like that. And so I think what we don't want to do is have another 100 years of that for new technology that we're inventing today. That has to be, again, go through this entire process of the 2000s of inaccessibility, and maybe in the year 2100 we have it. Let's avoid that, obviously. And I think when we look at innovation and equity, we need to be looking at, are the tools that we're innovating, one, accessible to all, and two, are they being used to provide service and meeting people with what they need for transportation around cities today. And one aspect of that, which I know we'll get into later, is this idea of providing equitable access to jobs and social and economic opportunities, as well as other opportunities around cities. And we've started off by doing this with the private automobile since really the 50s and 60s, post-war in the United States. And that infrastructure is completely inaccessible by default. You have to be able to drive a car and own a car, and then when you park it, walk around the city or be able to find places to get to once you're in the infrastructure of sidewalks and other places on the street, which aren't always accessible. And I think we can have a chance to now look at, with the modes that we have available to us today, including public transportation, private automobiles, TNCs, taxis, et cetera, are we able to create a more accessible system, more accessible transportation system that's not just accessible physically, but also accessible digitally, and people who are unbanked and undated and other aspects of barriers that we have today. So I would like to see that be a focus, and tactically speaking, because I think we can always talk about these from like a high level, like, oh, it's not accessible. What does that mean to actually do that? And we're seeing the transportation reauthorization bill coming up this fall or summer, hopefully, We're seeing coronavirus relief monies coming out very soon. These are the opportunities, especially since we've had a year now to debate this coronavirus relief stuff. This isn't a rush anymore. Last May was a rush. This is not. We can use this money and actually attach performance metrics, attach outcomes that we want from this money, and ask the private sector and the public sector, what can you do to achieve these outcomes? And let's make sure that kind of stuff is in this bill to make sure that actually happens. And what should we be avoiding? So this is the time to really tackle that issue.
All right, I'm going to come back and have some follow-up questions on that, but first I'm going to turn it over to Stan.
Well, I think I'll make it unanimous maybe around the use of innovation and kind of some of the discomfort maybe that's associated with it. Myself, I think initially my perspective working at ENO was largely focused on the U.S. transportation system and innovation and technology and the buzzwords of digital and smart cities and I think they're very important, and I don't want to kind of poo-poo the idea of it, but I think as I've gotten the opportunity to now kind of look more outward and external, the impacts are even higher. Sometimes negatively or in a negative kind of connotation, sometimes in a positive connotation. I think one of the things that I've, in my role at the World Bank and now with ITDP, I've seen that innovation does trickle down to lower income and middle income countries, and it's having significant impacts in terms of the ways that the services are accessed. But generally, again, it's coming at a kind of snail's pace in some respects, and it often has many other issues in terms of access, affordability, the environmental kind of constraints, infrastructure constraints, that I think when I think about this, I'm largely framing it in like some of the foundational things that the U.S. system already has in place. Other places are kind of looking to even just meet that standard. Sometimes they get to leapfrog past some of these issues that the U.S. has kind of encountered on that front, but I think largely it's usually about trying to set up the processes, set up the kind of steps that are necessary for creating standards like ADA. I think that's something that I think is, obviously the World Bank, I think ITDP and many organizations focus on when they're trying to kind of externally project these type of projects and ideas, that, there's environmental kind of issues you need to be thinking about. There's issues in terms of focusing on communities that are disadvantaged or have challenges when kind of addressing things like mass or rail or bus access, that I particularly find important in kind of communicating in terms of funding. From the bank's perspective, that was one of their biggest kind of points that they wanted to draw, and that was making sure that these projects were trying to tackle these specific issues by making sure that there was an awning, making sure that there was specific things that were helping communities that are largely, again, being greatly affected by not only this project, but will have the greatest impact on this project or by this project. So I think, again, it's something that we as stakeholders, as advocates in this space, need to kind of constantly reinforce and to be thinking about. I mean, I like the kind of paradigm shift of focusing on disadvantaged or disabled communities first before we think about the larger kind of system as a whole. I do think that I think they deserve special treatment. So that's something that should be something that be the priority, the focus early on, and then we can kind of open it up to the larger group as a whole.
Great, thank you all. And I'm gonna sort of cut to the conversation we're having in the chat as long as we're there right now. Also, Jocelyn asked if there's an exemplar public transit system, and maybe this would be sort of beyond just public transit, to also incorporate some of the elements that Chris mentioned of like transportation and land use. Is there somewhere in the world that we can see that's really sort of set up the entire transportation and land use design that we can really look at as an example? Whoever wants to answer, go for it.
I'm gonna fall into this trap. So again, I feel very fortunate to be in Singapore, and I guess from my own experience in the U.S. and then now kind of seeing the countries around Singapore, even there's a vast difference in terms of the quality of service. They seem to have managed to do public transportation right. They have tons of buses, there's tons of rail, there's a focus on limiting car purchases and usage. They have congestion taxing, they plan down to the meter. They are very specific. And I think, again, it serves as I think more of a case study or proof of concept. I don't necessarily think Singapore is a replicable model. And I think that's largely for governance issues and politics and policy aside. But I do think that it's good to see, like, again, a bus stop full of people who are wearing masks during the times of COVID, who are paying, with contactless cards, who are kind of using a system in a way that was, I think, what we all, hope and dream that a transportation system would kind of address. So yeah, I feel very lucky, and I also feel very, unfortunate that I would love to see this kind of applied globally. That it's still got a ways to go in other places.
Great, and yeah, I'm jealous. I've never been able to experience that system. Chris and Carol, did you guys have any other specific systems or locations that you think we can look at as good examples?
I was just adding that Boston would be perhaps the most improved award, if you will. It's nowhere near Singapore's level of accessibility or I think design, but the fact that Boston is such a walkable city, and they've made a lot of progress in adding elevators and other accessibility features to their system since, it took a lawsuit, an ADA lawsuit in 2000s to do this, but they responded really well to it. And I think that's a great sign of an organization, just, through multiple governors, multiple CEOs, continues to push forward for not just more elevators, but elevators that work and are clean. And I think it's a good example of if someone wants to do a case study on like how an organization transitions like that. I think the MBTA would be an interesting one to look at there.
And this is Carol. I just add that Boston has a really strong and awesome disability advocate working at MBTA, Christopher Hart, and some other really wonderful disability advocates in that system who are, I think, have worked hard for many years to make sure that there are improvements, but also that any new services are gonna work for everybody. So I don't think it's an accident. And then I would just keep the focus on Massachusetts and say I have been all year really happy to see that they have a pedestrian plan for the state, and that includes a sidewalk and a curb ramp survey. That's all that I know. The only thing I can find online, but that makes me so excited. and so I just try to tell everybody, like, this is what we should be doing everywhere. And that Stephanie Pollock, who is at MassDOT, is now at DOT, I think is a really good sign. So yeah.
Great, excellent. So I'm going to go back a little bit to since we are science and technology policy fellows, and we started talking about some of the policies behind what makes transportation more equitable and accessible. Chris mentioned in his introduction also that, we're sort of up for reauthorization, a new bill in the United States. I know that Carol has done a lot of work sort of looking at what should be going into legislation and regulation, and what has gone into legislation and regulation. And then I'm also curious from Stan's perspective, sort of what we can learn, especially with his expertise in the US and then in many other countries, of where should we be going from a policy perspective? In what ways can policy enable more access, and in what ways can it stifle more access? And so what should we be thinking about looking ahead in the policy realm? Whoever wants to go.
Okay, I'll start. This is Carol. I'm just really thinking about reauthorization. If you can find all this CCD, if you look for CCD transportation, we have a web page and all of our policy documents are up there. But things that we were looking at last year that we hoped would make it into reauthorization were actually two bills. One, the Disability Access to Transportation Act, and just blanking on the other one. It was an transportation equity bill. But the first one had a number of provisions that that we really wanted to see, including adoption of the Access Board's 2011 public rights of way standards, which really need to be adopted, and a pilot program looking at having one stop in paratransit rides would be especially useful for parents who want to drop their kids off at school, or people who want to drop off their dry cleaning, or do any number of things. Improving the complaint process and compliance process at the FTA so that people can sort of improve transit where they are. We had a couple of other things, and making sure there's adequate funding for everything that we need, and including the Section 5310, which provides funding to like accessible taxis on demand, travel training, which is huge, and we'll need for AVs as well, and then any sort of new innovative thing. And then on the equity side is really looking at enforcement, fare-free service, and really thinking about Title VI and environmental justice. So wanting to make sure all of those things are in service transportation. And when we're thinking about, or like, I mean, I like on-demand service and all that it can do, and I've really seen having access to services like accessible taxis or accessible Uber, Lyft change people's lives in my community. It really has. My strong concern and what I want to see always in policy is to make sure that those services aren't supplanting transit. And that transit agencies aren't then cutting transit lines, which then cuts paratransit service areas. So those are my top level concerns.
Yeah, I think this policy question, it really does come into what, where the priorities are going to be for the administration, and where they're going to be wanting to spend the most time and effort in updating. I think we've seen this in like larger transit allocations, from new starts, where we were looking at, efficiencies during the early 2000s to environmental impacts in the mid 2000s. And I think now we have another chance to write another priority in there, however it might be. And it sounds like sustainability and equity will be priorities from the administration. How that gets translated into text and into work will be interesting to see. But I think it will be, I think this is a good time to revisit what it is that we're doing with our federal transportation dollars, the capital that we're building, to what end, the operations that we're not subsidizing or subsidizing, and again, to what end. If we think back to like where this all started, with the Federal Highway Administration building highways, the interstates, and that was the thing, right? Building freeways. And then we only got the flexibility and funding to do transit in the 90s to be able to flex some highway funding into transit, which Portland and other cities have been doing since then to build light rail and other systems. But it's a lot of building and not necessarily linking that to land use or linking that to outcomes that we actually want. And this is not to pick on a couple agencies, which I like a lot, but it's just that they come up in newspaper articles sometimes, which is in Denver and in Dallas, people have, I think Transit Center actually mentioned this in a couple blog posts, that they're very large construction agencies building lots of passenger miles of light rail. And I think you've seen Dallas switch it out a bit, and they're starting to focus more on serving riders and becoming mobility managers and optimizing service. But the legacy of building for building's sake is still there in our agencies today. And so I think we have to ask, okay, so what are we trying to accomplish then with all this construction? And is capital the actual best way to accomplish what we're trying to do? Maybe it is operations, maybe the best way to get people off the streets and into homes is actually building them homes and not these side projects, right? And I think the same kind of mentality we need to bring to transportation. And maybe the best way to get people from A to B is to get them from A to B in a consistent basis and not go on large construction projects. Now, that's not to say building heavy rail like Second Avenue subway or light rail is a waste of money. No way. As long as land use and other things match that. But I think we seem to be pivoting our federal policy to be more outcomes oriented rather than necessarily physical infrastructure oriented.
Well, I'll just add, I guess, maybe from my perspective, and I think starting off when I was, you know, like this talk of the reauthorization bill, it seems like a great opportunity to kind of refocus, reposition DOT, as well as I guess internally the many infrastructure issues that the U.S. is experiencing. I now think of it or equate it to certain parts of the developing world, and so the idea that that, you know, like there's a lot of these capital projects that are taking place are going to be expanding access or expanding kind of service for others. Is sometimes I think maybe we need to kind of think about and calibrate appropriately. I generally think of the best kind of angles for me, at least from the policy perspective, is typically the funding and financing. Those are I think the kind of teeth or the areas in which you can kind of hold projects accountable, and developing, I guess, you know, certain processes around contracting or operation and maintenance, which I think are often left off the kind of conversation when we're talking about making large investments, infrastructure or service related. That I find, at least from the perspective of lower and middle income countries, is one of the biggest challenges, but also something that I think really creates, again, the mechanisms and the kind of systems that are necessary for places to really think about this in a more scientific or rigorous method that oftentimes I think, in places in the developing world don't have the either technical capacity or are just limited by the funding constraints. So the other element I think that we often also forget about this in the policy space is partnerships. I mean, I think there are numerous organizations and advocates and stakeholders who are involved in this space that really can help shape and guide and make sure projects are thinking about this holistically and not something that's just attacking it, one specific problem, but thinking about this in a constructive manner that allows for, again, the most access and a reliable service or a reliable kind of or affordable method of transportation that ITDP is particularly kind of you know, touching on in terms of focusing on sustainability. I think the idea, or we're bullish on electrification and its impacts on numerous communities and mostly disadvantaged communities as well, because I think improving the quality of buses around the world is going to be something that I think we're very obviously keen on developing and exposing. So.
Great, and yeah, I think you know, buses is something that we often don't talk about as much when we start talking about infrastructure, because there's not as much of an associated infrastructure with, well, ride hail and buses and those sorts of transportation options, but they can really provide a lot of extra mobility. I see that Danielle has a question in the chat, and instead of reading it out, actually, Danielle, do you want to just unmute yourself and we can work on turning this into more of a conversation? Go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. So my question is, and maybe it's not quite accessibility related, but it does go to the question about innovation. What policies would you recommend to bolster transit in light of emerging new technologies like mobility as a service or AVs? And especially after COVID and a year in which everyone's been kind of discouraged to take public transit. Thanks.
I think I would start with what is it that we want out of transit to begin with, and I think so. This is going to be this is where equity, I think, and this is where a lot of things collide, I should say, because when you start thinking about transit in terms of like, you have to be starting to prioritize things. So if we take like, you know, Portland, where I'm at now, and we say that we want a transit system that is high frequency, that isn't not just a 9 to 5, because as we all know, 9 to 5 is not everything. There are a lot of essential workers that work outside those hours and those days. What does that look like? I think that looks like a lot of high frequency bus routes in areas not always served by transit. That might be like the east side of Portland, or you know, name your city, the part that's not in the central business district. perhaps serving some of the suburbs better, perhaps serving some areas frequently that have not been served with that frequency before. And then that goes into then, okay, so if that is going to be our policy, are we going to be sacrificing a little bit during the peak hour? And are we going to be needing more funds in order to make that happen? And so I think that, and then also we're going to be pulling back service from areas that are more car oriented and saying, we just cannot serve those areas because we have to choose here. And I think that's going to be up for each community to decide what they want for their community. But I think generally speaking, I would want to see transit be funded sufficiently such that it is an attractive mode to use in multiple cities, and that it does have the green light to experiment around the edges where potentially new mobility modes such as TNCs or AVs down the line that are accessible with wheelchair accessible vehicles for TNCs or for AVs and other accessibility features as well are able to be integrated into that mix. And I think without that experimentation, we won't be able to fully understand what the potential possibilities are and bring them in, but we have to be able to put in the right policy guidelines to make sure that we are integrating in an accessible system from the beginning and not necessarily building another inaccessible system on top.
This is Carol. I just add to that, making sure that it's a little bit repeating what Chris said, but when we have things like first mile, last mile, or ways to get people to transit, they honestly are not always accessible. So making sure that they're accessible for everybody, making sure they're being provided in all the neighborhoods that actually need access to transit. And everywhere, making sure that transit is meeting the needs of the communities. We have so much work to do around this country on making transit stations accessible, and not just to meet the standards of the ADA, because I mean it feels like a sort of trite thing to say, but the ADA is definitely a floor. Like it is a bare minimum standard. So if you hear any leader say, oh, and you ask them, what are you doing? And they say, oh, we're ADA compliant. I'm like, that's nowhere near good enough. Like you need to aim so much higher. So, making those improvements, but actually like really making transit like something that people enjoy, like everybody enjoys, making sure the elevators are working and the escalators and that the bus stops are accessible and the sidewalks and like all of those things, the bus stop accessibility, sidewalk accessibility, broadband access, you need all of those things for AVs to work. so and like we need to work on them now so like there's so much hype about autonomous vehicles and how great they're going to be for the disability community, but unless the sidewalks are accessible, unless we have broadband, unless we have all of those things, like we're not going to be able to get to the car. Like so it doesn't matter. So just I guess that. And yeah, one thing I'm really tired of working on AV policy, quite honestly, but one thing I enjoyed is working with one of the manufacturers, one of the car companies, and talking about potential accessible AVs, and it was really refreshing because they said like we actually, if we're going to do this and we're going to create a new kind of car and a new kind of way of getting around, we want to make it an enjoyable experience. I was like, that's so nice, and we don't usually talk about that, So I guess that's what I'd like. So yeah.
I'd just like to quickly add. I mean, I think, and again, you mentioned the issue of innovation, and of course the usage of mobility as a service and autonomous vehicles. I think from the developing, kind of lower income and middle income countries perspective, there's great opportunity there. One of the biggest issues I think actually, and this is we haven't necessarily touched upon it, is informal transportation or paratransit in the global sense is something that is it's one of the largest forms of transportation that are used by most people in the world, actually. I mean, outside of the US and in many developed countries, many people take either a motorcycle or a minibus or a microbus or van to and from their, to their services, or to get to their job, or to get to, to be able to access the things that they need to access. That technology has really greatly, vastly improved the quality of being able to actually map these things. That's something that at this point is something that's the bare minimum of what I think when we think about like these kind of semi-formal systems, we don't even know where they are. We don't know how the routes can change daily, can change based off of the pattern of customers or where they're picking up. I mean, these are like almost organic and responsive kind of services that pop up that, again, aren't necessarily thinking about the kind of specific communities. They're just focusing on trying to kind of meet a need for the market. So technology has greatly, I mean, there's a couple of companies that are working with the World Bank. We've worked with Transjakarta in Indonesia to kind of start the kind of codifying and researching and making sure that the steps are in place to kind of build in linkages between payments. They just started a program called Jaklinggo in Indonesia that actually helps people who are using the BRT system quickly scan in and pay for their microbus, which is an informal system there. So these are little small things that are actually happening in real time that are trickling down from the US or trickling down from higher income countries that are actually having great impacts for lower income countries and middle income countries as well. I think in a post-COVID world, which was the other part of that question, I think it's really interesting. I think, we're having our all staff meeting, and last year our CEO was telling us like, 2020 was the year of bikes and 2021 will be the year of pedestrians. And in my mind, I'm like, when is the year of buses, or when is the year of public transportation? And maybe, 2021 will be that year, but right now it's not starting off on good footing. But I think if you can provide a reliable, safe, clean, and effective service, that starts to build that confidence that's necessary. And I think from the U.S. perspective, it's going to be a process. It's an iterative thing that, many people who use public transportation are using it because it's the only service that they have access to. And so I think, and that can largely applies outside of the U.S. as well. And many people have continued to use informal transportation services that have not necessarily done the due diligence of cleaning or providing a safer environment. So I think what we would like to see, obviously, is this kind of this focus on health and improving the quality of service, that people just have the confidence and know that they can use the service in a way that's effective and reliable.
Great. Awesome. And I was going to ask, while you were talking, Stan, I was thinking of asking, and what are people doing to collect these data? And you covered it, so that's excellent. And on a related topic, actually, now I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who has a data-related question. Go ahead, Katie.
Hey guys, this is lovely. Thanks for doing this. I'm Katie Wells. I have a question about data gathering with regard to accessibility data. I am a researcher at Georgetown University, and one of the things that we've been finding is that in the local level in DC, the transit policy folks don't have access to data about accessibility when it comes to mobility on demand. That because of some of the partnerships that they've developed with third parties, that they're not really sure how accessible some of these new services are. And so I'm wondering if you guys could talk about, maybe there's a place that is able to get enough data to know the effects or not.
Katie, just to clarify, do you mean that collecting data or getting data on accessibility from like the agency's partners, or just in general in the community that they're serving?
I guess I was thinking from the policymakers, so that they could make really good decisions about the effects of these new services on, let's say, transit planning. Because I think it's sort of hard to govern, right, if you can't like figure out what's happening on the ground. And so some of the questions that we've heard over the last 10 years in DC is like, well, how are, like, since Chris, you're at Uber, I could use that as an example. Like, well, how is that sort of augmenting our ability to offer an accessible paratransit, a paratransit option? Or, and should that shift the way we plan or not? And so I was just like, I wasn't expecting them to be like, well, we don't know. So I'm curious, are there cities in the world internationally that really have a strong sense that you guys look to as, wow, they really are keeping track of and knowing the effects of this different innovative, different kinds of transit options on their, ridership. And I don't know, maybe New York City does like an awesome job with like how inaccessible the subway is. But I'm just curious, like how folks keep track of it.
Yeah, there's data. I'd say one example is California. They have, I forget what the bill is called, but it's like a TNC Access for All, I think it's called. And they collect a 5 to 10 cent fee per TNC trip, whether it's Uber or Lyft or other TNCs. And that goes into a general, not a general fund, a set aside fund, which then the TNCs can be applied for that funding back should they show, by demonstrating accessible TNCs in certain counties in California. So it's county by county. And the part of that application comes with data. So like we at Uber will share, we'll answer some questions that the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, asks as part of that reimbursement process. And so they're able to get a snapshot per quarter, I believe, as to what the state of accessibility looks like in the counties that we're applying for. And that might be like, I forget exactly what they're asking for, but I think it's like about like average wait time or number of riders served with TNCs, that kind of thing. New York TLC and Chicago have more data. They have different regulations or laws in those cities, which they've, like in the New York City, they actually passed a law, which I think Alice, you wrote a blog about it too back in terms of like performance metrics, what they should use in terms of wait time as a metric to measure TNC performance for accessibility. And so they set a floor of like X% of trips have to be within 15 minutes or less wait time by 2020. By 2021, I think it's 10 minutes or less and a higher percentage of trips. And so they collect data from Uber and Lyft and Via and other, not just us, but a bunch of other for-hire vehicle companies on that. And so they have a pretty good picture of the situation there on what's going on in New York.
And this is Carol. Hi, Katie. I just add my personal experience. I was doing local DC advocacy work when we had a TNC bill at the local level. That was, I think, a TNC Amendment Act, maybe. I forget exactly. It's been a number of years. But we were working really hard on data and trying to get accessibility data in there and non-discrimination provisions. And it was a battle. It was a fight. And I don't remember what we ended up with. I think we wanted a number of things, like the number, we wanted the city to be able to track, the number of accessible rides requested, how many were actually provided, and then how many were canceled, because so many are canceled because it doesn't come in time, and then complaints and those sorts of things. That's what we wanted to get in there. I can't remember what we did wind up getting in, but what I do remember is that none of it would be, they put in, none of it would be FOIA-able. So we wouldn't have access to it anyway. And that was something that we saw, that we have seen around the country. And that sort of trying to get those sorts of provisions in local bills was something that we were working on in the disability community, and just really hitting that same wall every time. And we see it too, and like micromobility and thinking about bike shares and scooters and just across modes.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, Katie. And I think what Carol is talking about is it's this very strong tension that exists, and having been on both sides of the table now, I can see it both ways, between companies like Uber and city governments, state governments, advocates, which is transparency into what is going on in general, for this case, in your particular question about accessibility, and the desire of cities and advocates to understand what is the state of accessibility in on-demand transportation today in my community, or in transportation in general, right? Very valid question. And then there's the defensive posture of companies like the one I'm at, and others that are like, we don't want to share any data. And there's this fear of data sharing in terms of a very real worry about privacy. Like for example, Uber's position on data is that the data is the user's data. We are the stewards of that data, and just like you probably wouldn't want Facebook or Apple to share your data with the government, a lot of users don't want us to do the same thing. Now, there's also a balance though between that and being able to know what is going on our city streets. And so I think this negotiation continues today, tomorrow, will continue for a long time, is to figure out what the right balance is. I think we're getting to a better place. It's far from perfect, but I think as our company gets more understanding of the needs, and I think as cities get more understanding of the privacy concerns and competitive concerns as well, we will arrive at a place, I know we will, where we're sharing the right amount of data that answers the questions of the city while still protecting the privacy and competitive needs of like my company, for example. And one of the biggest things I think that has to be solved is this issue of trust. And neither side trusts each other right now in terms of what they're saying. And I'm being very blunt about this because I think it needs to be discussed more. And I think that, for the private sector, not to pick on my own company too much here, but the private sector tends to not trust government because if you stick your head out, you will get the nail that sticks out gets the hammer, right? And so if you look at taxes and congestion fees in cities, they don't come down on Ford, Toyota, and BMW. They come down on Uber and Lyft and scooters because those stick out like a sore thumb on our streets. And private cars blend in like the background that they have become, unfortunately, in our cities. And so there is a fear among companies, and I guarantee you Detroit doesn't want to do this either, because the moment you start sharing data is the moment you are managed, right? You can't manage what you can't measure, and that goes both ways. Now, and there's also mistrust on the city side of private companies. Like,
Chris, I'm not going to let you go on too long because I want to get Dan's opinion in here as well. But I also wanted to point out that beyond the trust and the existing relationships between older forms of transportation, I think part of it, now I'm gonna come in and argue from the academic side, because we're a fellowship from people coming out of world of academia, which is the role of data scientists and people with expertise in science and technology. And I'd say part of it too is building up that capacity of the expertise that are needed to be able to figure out what the best data sharing is on both sides, the private and public sector, and develop that workforce, and that might help develop that trust that you were saying that's needed as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have one more question, but before we go there, Stan, was there anything you wanted to add to the discussion?
No, I was really enjoying what Chris's role there. I'm sorry I got cut short a little bit, but I think you hit the, not to be pun intended, but nail on the head in terms of that kind of balance that needs to be struck. I do think there is a general distrust and something that, again, there's some historical kind of context in terms of why that exists, but I think there's also they created great opportunities for each other, and I think there's really an opportunity to come to share these services and to really enhance the quality of life for most people. So
great. All right. Well, I'm gonna turn it over. We're gonna run just a few minutes late. Nathan asked a question over here in the chat that many of us in the field of transportation have heard over and over in arguments for either side. So Nathan, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. And I'm curious to see what the responses are.
Thanks, Alice. And I am actually not in the field of transportation. My background is biomedical science. So I hope that I'm not asking a question that has been beat to like a dead horse, but my question is related to things that I've seen in my hometown, Atlanta, as well as another city in Georgia, Savannah, a smaller transit system. But I'm interested and curious what, in terms of access for disabled folks and other, underrepresented or economically challenged folks, when you have a system that is trying to prioritize or even balance service frequency versus coverage. And I think that that's something that's kind of happening now in Atlanta and probably happens over and over again in many systems. And so just from the mind of access, I'm just curious what your responses would be. Thanks.
Yeah, so this is about this, so this is like the ultimate Jarrett Walker question, right?
That's who I thought of immediately.
Nathan, have you read
Question,
Human
Nathan,
Transit?
don't worry about being outside the field.
Nathan, have you read Human Transit by Jarrett Walker?
I have not.
Highly recommend you put that on your book list immediately.
Okay.
Because this question that you ask is the fundamental core of that book. And I'm not going to speak for Jared because he puts it way better than I will, but just really briefly, it really is about how cities, whatever communities are going to be prioritizing. And some will choose that, a balance of the two as like a 70-30 split, 80-20 split between the two. But it really is about what is important to the community in terms of what neighborhoods they want to serve, why they want to serve them, and the resources that they have available to them to do so. I think that's the most, I think, quickest way I can put it. I'll see if Stan and Carol have anything to add to that, though.
I can just see his slides in my head. Like it's about how you design the system, and you can make it better so you can get both. and then everything Chris said. So yes, highly recommend.
I'll just add from my perspective, at least the places that I see, and specifically in Southeast Asia, I mean, a lot of it is focused on frequency, just because of some of the density issues in certain places within, if you're thinking of Manila or Jakarta or some of the larger cities in Southeast Asia, or even as you get further and further out, there seems to be at least a focus on that, because it seems to kind of cover I guess the greater percentage of the population. I do think that then leaves holes and gaps, and this is something that I kind of again touched on with this informal transportation kind of element of it, where these things are not being met, and so informal companies will start up, or associations will get together to kind of try to bridge that gap. And I think the real thing is, again, it is trying to strike a balance, but it's also about, look, if somebody's doing it better or somebody's doing it well, how do you learn from that? How do you even integrate that? Is there a possibility of those things existing that tries to, again, kind of tackle that issue of coverage versus frequency? Because it's one of the biggest issues policymakers have to kind of think about when they're kind of, especially for a new service. What do you do, and where's your focus? Where does your focus lie? So I don't really have a good answer for that. I wish, again, it was something a little more cogent and sharper, but definitely check out Jarrett Walker's stuff, because I think he's really, again, very adamant and specific about it.
Great, thank you, and good questions from everybody. We're already running over, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I want to thank our panelists so much for all of your great discussion and information. And before we end, I want to do a little sort of wait, don't tell me style round question, because I was really intrigued with what Stan said earlier about how we've had the year of equity, we've had the year of automated vehicles, we've had the year of the bicycle, we haven't had the year of the bus yet. But because I began my journey in transportation with pedestrians, I'm going to ask you each to predict what year do you think we'll finally make it to having the year of the pedestrian?
It's going to have to happen this term of the administration. I would say it will happen in 2023.
All right.
I'll say maybe, I mean, again, the way that my organization is thinking about it is 2021 is the year of pedestrians. So hopefully that comes to fruition.
Carol?
Sure. I feel like I should just do 2022 just for the heck of it. Sometime in the next couple years. And then that it'll be sort of integrated into the racial equity work that's going to be so important at DOT. In this administration. So yeah.
Excellent. Let's make it happen. Well, thank you all, and thank you everybody for joining us and for your great questions and engagement. And we will see you next month for our next AAAS Developing Infrastructure Group meeting.